Before I introduce the next moderator, I also want to say a special thank you to the New Belgium Brewery. Give them a nice hand. They've provided some mighty fine cold refreshment over in the Alliance Center, and we certainly do appreciate all they've done for us. At this point, I would like to introduce the next forum, the next panel. The name of it is the New American Consensus on International Cooperation. It is presented by the United Nations Foundation. The United Nations Foundation was founded by Ted Turner, and the UN Foundation builds and implements public-private partnerships to address the world's most pressing problems and broadens support for the United Nations through advocacy and public outreach. It's my pleasure to introduce to you the moderator of this panel, Mr. Steve Clemens, who is the director of the American Strategy Program at the New American Foundation and a senior fellow at that organization. Steve?
I'll just use this. It's good to be with all of you. Thank you very much. We've got an interesting program, and it's nice to talk to the people online who are watching downstairs where it's nice and cool. I want to say a special welcome to Congressman Bill Delahunt, who's here. You know, it's interesting to see the congressmen who are engaged outside of the big tent and coming out to meet some of the people, and particularly who are taking seriously many of the new media, and particularly those people who are involved and engaged. You know, one of the things I said this morning is you see political events all over, but when you're getting into policy and substance and you see bloggers there, that's a sign of great health, I think, in the sort of blogging and new media community. Today, as mentioned, we're going to discuss the New American Consensus on International Cooperation. And I'm going to introduce two people. Before I do that, though, I'm going to give one of our guests today is a pollster, and I'm going to say something about a rival polling outfit. The Pew Charitable Trust recently released their Global Attitude Survey. And in that, this survey, which was a survey of 24 nations and 24,000 people, found overwhelming interest in this election here in the United States. In fact, our election has done a great deal to actually get America on a slightly better track, not an enormously better track, in terms of people's mind of sort of looking at what we're doing here. And I think that this convention has helped. But another part of it, which is very interesting, and this is not a biased comment anyway, is there's overwhelming support and interest in Barack Obama's candidacy. If the world were to vote, the world would vote today for Barack Obama. And so it's very interesting to have that in the back of our mind, but also to look at the flip side of that, about what Americans think about the rest of the world. And to do that, we've got two great people. We've got Jeff Guerin. Jeff is president of the Peter D. Hart Research Associates, and if you're into pollsters and communications advice and framing, you'll know Jeff Guerin's name and know that he played a key role in Hillary Clinton's campaign, Hillary Clinton's work. He's also helped in the campaigns of Dick Durbin, Dianne Feinstein, Chuck Schumer, Russ Feingold, Robert Byrd, Jay Rockefeller, Pat Leahy. It goes on and on and on. I just asked him about a young man who worked in his office who's a closeted blogger, we can put it that way. He's a great blogger, and I said, you know, was he the Obama plant? And he says, no, I was the Hillary plant in my office, because everyone else in his office was supportive of Barack Obama, he said. He became president of Hart Research in 1984, after having worked in the firm since '78 as a senior analyst. And he has worked for many great foundations, universities, schools, trade associations, to help us understand the trends of how people are thinking. And we then have, offering some thoughts on Jeff's comments, is Solana Larsen, who's a Danish-Puerto Rican journalist and activist. And she's been a real entrepreneur in the new media world, and has established a very famous website called Global Voices, which, as best I understand it, helps bring bloggers from around the world, particularly those writing in different languages than English, and help create a portal so that bloggers and communicators in media and others here can have access to how they're thinking about us. She's also been partnering with Reuters, a supporter of the Global Voices website, in a project called Voices Without Votes, and what others around the world are thinking about our election. So I think these are great resources, and Solana Larsen will offer some commentary. Jeff Guerin has been working on an 18-month project with Bill McInturff. Bill McInturff is John McCain's principal pollster, and I spent an evening with them about 10 months ago where they unveiled the first part of a project which was very complicated for Bill McInturff to present, because Jeff, I remember, had to leave early that night. And this Republican pollster had to come in and talk about how internationalism, how engagement, how returning to a railroad track in a different direction that was not, I would call, Jesse Helms-inspired pugnacious nationalism. Our friend Bill McIntyre from the McCain camp had to help present that. This is the second phase of a rollout, an update, if you will, and I'm going to turn the mic over to Jeff to help share with us his findings in this study. Jeff Guerin.
Thank you very much. I don't know that, no, my microphone is working. So I'm delighted to be here with you today to share the results of the survey. Very often when I do these kinds of presentations, I have a PowerPoint behind me, and I will spare you that. The PowerPoint is online and the other survey results along with it, and it's worth looking at. It's really good research. As Steve mentioned, this has been a progression of research, a series of focus groups, national surveys, more focus groups, and then this new survey that I'm about to describe to you today. The goal really to not just understand where the center of gravity is in America today on America's role in the world and the national security and foreign affairs agenda, but also how to express this concept of international cooperation in a language and as part of a narrative that voters will respond to. And I think we've done that. But let me start with the really what I think is most important about this is that the foreign policy and national security context for this election in terms of what's important to the voters and how they see the world is almost entirely different from what it was in 2004. For a long, considerable while, the events of 9/11 really defined the way Americans thought about national security and foreign affairs, that terrorism was the defining issue on the national security agenda. Really, they were, not to the exclusion of all other things, but the American voters had a comfort level with a leader who focused on that and really didn't pay very much attention to other kinds of things. The preeminent priority was to protect America, to keep America safe, and that to do whatever it took to do that, even if it meant acting on our own. Well, 9/11 is still an important part of the equation. It's obviously a resonant memory and event for the large majority of Americans, but it is no longer what defines the way people think about foreign policy and what they look for in terms of a presidential leader in national security and foreign affairs. We've had this great intervening event, which is the war in Iraq, and all of the problems that have been attendant upon that. And those events have been as important in defining where we are today and what the politics are of national security and foreign affairs as 9/11 was, so that when people think about what does it mean to be a good foreign policy leader, what we've learned about the experience from Iraq and how it's affected people's attitudes really does have a potent impact. There is one other important change in the world or in the country, which is that the changes in the economy and the personal impact of the energy crisis has had a huge effect on the agenda of the voters. So as recently as a year ago, if you ask voters, as we did in the NBC Wall Street Journal polling, which we also do with Bill McIntyre's firm, what's the most important issue these days? Iraq was number one by a lot. Iraq is no longer number one. It's been superseded by other kinds of things. The economy, first and foremost, the energy situation and the cost of gasoline, not far behind that. Iraq has fallen from, I think it was 47% to about 30%. The other great national security issue is terrorism. That has fallen also. So the basic agenda is no longer dominated by international issues. And in that context, when Americans think about our role in the world, given these great problems that we're facing in the country today, and we ask them, should the United States be more active or less active in the world? By a growing margin, it's now by a margin of 15 points, Americans have come to the conclusion that we ought to be less active rather than more active. There's a partisan divide on that. Among Republicans, it's evenly divided. Among Democrats, by about a 20-point margin, they say we ought to be less actively involved. But among independent voters, the kinds of swing voters who will decide the election, by a margin of 2 to 1 over 30 points, they're saying we ought to be less active rather than more active in the world. So that
just as a point of clarification, did you ask what active meant?
We didn't, and it's a great question, Steve, because I think for Democrats, what active has come to mean is what we did in Iraq.
Right.
And so if that's what you mean by active, and I think that that's what people have in their heads, they don't want that much of it. But even beyond that,
and do Republicans want more of it?
No, it's evenly divided, 48 to 48. But even so, that there is as people feel more economic pressures here at home, and they just want our leaders thinking a little bit more about fixing problems here, even if it means doing a little less to fix problems somewhere else. And now, having said that, and this is a slight challenge for Senator McCain, because he would like to make this election, as President Bush did in 2004, a national security referendum. He thinks he's got a large advantage on that. And, but there's a danger in doing that. If the last thing the American people want to do is to elect another president who is narrowly focused on Islamic extremism as the one and only defining challenge of our time. And so that if Senator McCain, in trying to press this advantage he thinks he has on national security, is seen as sort of overly dwelling on that, that's a huge risk for him with independent voters. While people do, and just sort of to go on with the important question you asked, Steve, while people do say we ought to be less active, they certainly reject the language of isolationism. That is, as Steve mentioned, we did a lot of work with language in this research, so that if you talk about isolationism, people said, no, that's not what I mean. And they don't want to elect somebody who will withdraw America from the world. That's not what they mean either. I think what they are looking for is something different from what President Bush offered. There's a recognition that for like it or not, we need to be engaged in the world. But what they talk about is a different way of being engaged in the world. People respond very positively to the language of international cooperation. They reject the language of going it alone, which has sort of become a definitional phrase for how people think about the foreign policy of the Bush administration. And that's really what they're rejecting, is that they are looking for something very different from this idea of going it alone. Sharing the burden, doing our fair share is perfectly acceptable. They don't want to do more, but don't think we can afford to do much less. The language of international cooperation works. There's other words that don't work. People don't like the word multilateralism. When we ask people, should be, in terms of dealing with problems in the world, should we mainly be acting on our own or mainly acting with our major allies and through established international organizations, 80% say we ought to be working with our allies and through major international organizations rather than doing it on our own. So there really is this pretty powerful consensus in that regard. And so that part of what presidential leadership becomes in this new world is who's able to do that, who's able to, has the mindset of creating the conditions and a willingness for this kind of international cooperation. The second thing that is very notable in the research is, as Steve mentioned, the Pew polling, and I'm sure you see this in your work all the time, is that Americans are aware of the fact that we are less respected in the world, They don't like it personally on an emotional level, but they also think it's important that it has real consequences, that it makes us less able to accomplish the things we want to be able to accomplish in the world. And when I say Americans feel this way, it's 3/4 of all Americans say that we're less respected in the world today, and of those, close to 8 out of 10 say it's having important consequences. And so that this then goes and creates a second challenge for a presidential leader, which is who can restore America's standing in the world and respect for America in the world today. And so that becomes a second piece of this. The third part of the equation that we looked at is we talked about a lot of different priorities in terms of the international agenda. Certainly terrorism is part of that, but it is no longer the dominant international priority. People think our most important national security priority today is not necessarily combating terrorism or Islamic extremism. It is to get us off of foreign oil. People see this as a pocketbook issue. They see it as a national security issue. So when you ask people what is the most important national security challenge, it is focused on stopping our dependence on foreign oil. Terrorism, yes, is part of the agenda for Democrats. They also put the highest priority for Democrats is to get our troops home from Iraq. And they would also like to restore respect in the world. For Republicans, they still put terrorism very high on their agenda. But the important point is a Republican candidate can no longer do what George Bush did in 2004, which is to try to make this only about fighting terrorism. People get that we have a more diverse array of issues that we ought to be dealing with. And in that regard, we asked people about different priorities for a president. Now, let me just say that as a Democrat, I believe it is very important to recognize that the price of admission is still a comfort level and a confidence level among the voters that if you're going to be elected as my president, you will do what it takes to keep America strong and secure. And people want to know that. It is fundamental. It is a threshold requirement. But having said that, really there is a high ground in the debate on how you do that, which is what people are looking for more than anything else is somebody who will have the right balance between our toughness and our use of military tools and diplomacy and our use of the non-military tools. And in the extraordinary priority people give that is really a commentary on their view of President Bush's approach. They think that he has failed to achieve the proper balance, that he is far too inclined to not just saber rattling, but using the sabers, and not nearly inclined enough to make the use of the diplomatic tools. So that balance really is the holy grail, and it means different things to different people, but it really is an important opportunity for Senator Obama if he can define himself as the person who represents that balance, in contrast to Senator McCain's bellicosity on things like, is that a word even?
Works.
On things like what happened in Georgia with Russia, that's very meaningful as well. And so, so this is the kind of this, and they want a president again who will be able to engage our allies, restore respect for America in the world. So the bottom line in all of this is that there really is a new center of gravity here that is very different from the one that existed in the immediate wake of 9/11. The center of gravity is not about doing whatever it takes. It is about recognizing this complex world, that understanding that the way we are best able to achieve our goals in the world requires cooperation, requires us to share to do our fair share, but also to be able to share the burden with our allies in meeting those goals. And from a political perspective, I think there's a real opportunity here on the Democratic side, which is to reframe the whole debate. That is, what does it mean, again, the debate about what does it mean to be a good national security leader in the world of 2008? Well, it is not the George Bush model of I'm a wartime president. The new model is somebody who will do what's necessary to protect America. That is definitely still part of the job description, but it also is somebody who will find that right balance between toughness and diplomacy, somebody who can improve respect for America in the world and restore America's reputation in the world, and somebody who has the inclination to and willingness to work with our allies and engage in international cooperation in order to achieve our goals. And given this different definition of what it means to be a good foreign policy leader and a national security leader, I think Barack Obama can make the case that he fits the bill better, he understands the world today better, and that rather than engaging in this debate on national security defensively, he really has a chance to go out here and frame a debate that will work for him and take on John McCain on what Senator McCain believes is a point of strength. So.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I also wanted to punctuate that today's forum and this research was supported by the Better World Campaign, which is a major project of the United Nations Foundation. And I wanted to add one little more item to Solana Larson's fascinating bio. Not only is she managing editor of Global Voices, but she has a personal blog that I assume is in English, Solanosaurus. Solanosaurus sounds totally cool. And she blogs in Danish about technology at Blogby Denmark, DK. And then she writes Habla Español. So from a truly international perspective, some comments from Solana Larson.
Thanks. I should also mention that I'm blogging at opendemocracy.net /USA during the convention. Well, it's interesting to be sitting next to a pollster in a way, because the website that I am the managing editor of is called Global Voices Online. And what we do is really not very scientific at all. We're trying simultaneously to take the temperature of world opinion all over the world based on what people are writing in their blogs in different countries, especially in the developing world. So now, throughout the Olympics, what are Chinese bloggers saying in their blogs? What are Russian bloggers writing in their blogs throughout the conflict to Georgia? How can we encourage bloggers here, media here, and Americans here to consider not just what foreign policy means for them, but what does it mean for people around the world? So, I mean, you have the promise of the World Wide Web as this giant system where people are talking across borders, but the reality is that most American bloggers are only reading and linking to other American bloggers. And that goes for the foreign policy bloggers as well as the national politics bloggers. So when Global Voices was created 3 years ago, I wasn't the founder of the project, but when it was created, the idea was step by step, okay, well, let's find bridge bloggers. Let's find people who can explain their country and their local politics so that a global audience can understand it. And since then, it's mushroomed into this community of bloggers all over who are translating daily, explaining things about what's important in their home blogospheres. And then the project originated here in the United States at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society, which is housed at Harvard University. Now it's like this virtual network of people all over, and often I go to these conferences and panels, and the questions that Americans always have is, well, what are world bloggers saying about us? And our response tends to be, well, it's not about the US. For once, this is about something that isn't the US, that doesn't concern them. For instance, right now on the homepage, I think we have an online campaign by Cambodian sex workers who are talking about an issue that's really important locally there. Or it might be, what are Chinese bloggers saying about the Olympics or different scandals, Iranian bloggers. The world is moving, and it doesn't rotate always around what the United States says or does. However, with the US election coming up, it is you know, it's a fact that the world is really interested and really excited, especially about a candidate like Barack Obama, who is so fascinating to people around the world. So Reuters, the international news agency Reuters, approached us and asked us if we wanted to collaborate on a project where we monitored what non-American bloggers were saying about the US election. And we said, nah, you know, they're probably not talking about this issue so much. But you know, we went out and we talked to our community, and they said, yes, we would like to do this. We would like to help inform US voters especially about what people are saying around the world. And the idea is not, you know, people will ask, well, what do Iranian bloggers think? Or what do Chinese bloggers think? But the idea isn't to show them off as like this monolith group. There are millions of bloggers in China, and of course they disagree on lots of issues. Iraqi bloggers aren't all in agreement on all issues. But we want to give little tastes of opinions, reasoning behind opinions, show how different the perspective is. So for instance, so we created this website called Voices Without Votes, where we have daily updates. For instance, right now we have some posts up about what non-American bloggers are saying about the convention here. How did people around the world respond to Michelle Obama's speech? And the interesting thing is, yes, people are talking about Obama, you know, to a much, much higher degree than they're talking about McCain, but it's not all positive. I mean, the African bloggers, of course, love his background, but they're also very upset that he's not African enough, right? Or the Muslim bloggers will find it interesting that his background relates to Islam in some way, but they find that he's not Muslim enough. Or, you know, there could be any range of things. The Palestinian bloggers are mad about what he did in Israel, or there are many, many different positions which are interesting to see, and we're hoping that we might help, you know, bring home the reality of how US foreign policy affects real lives, ordinary people. And our goal is to get the media to pay attention, to get American bloggers to pay attention, and to try and, you know, help persuade public opinion, you know, so that the outcomes of your polls might have more good news like what you've had.
Well, it turns out people care what others think about America and think it matters.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Solana. I'd like to open the floor for questions and comments. Before I do, let me ask Jeff a question that interests me. Tonight is the theme. This is Wednesday, right? I'm sort of losing track.
It's National Security Night.
Yeah, Securing America, National Security Night. And it seems to me that what Barack Obama has been trying to do, and he was trying very hard during the challenge with Hillary Clinton, and I think he continues to try and do it, is to be a mix of communicating that he's not going to be a pushover when it comes to military challenges, but he's also trying to say there's a different way to achieve stability and a different equilibrium in the world than just sending out brigades. And what I'm interested in, I think this is Steve Clemens' view, I think we're at a point of major historical discontinuity, that everything we do tomorrow can't be based on inertia that came from yesterday. And while you need a requisition experience, we need to kind of rethink and reorganize this stuff, which means that's the substance. But when you're selling it through rhetoric and speeches with people who are looking for binary choices, black and white framing, which I think Steve Schmidt of the McCain campaign is so good at, when the appropriate response needs to be, maybe we need shades of gray. So as a pollster, do you think polling creates a bias in people's minds or reads a bias for wanting a black and white picture, a depiction of two choices that ends up being kind of a false metaphor for the kinds of answers America needs today, which may be a much more subtle approach, nuanced approach, where there is no easy framing. I know it's complex, but when I look at this data, I wonder whether someone trying to sell stability in a different way would get very far in the minds of Americans in the kind of polling you've done.
Well, the answer to your larger question about the impact of polling is sometimes yes, sometimes no. Sometimes people truly do see things in binary terms, and they did after 9/11. But what polling sometimes also reveals is that people get that the world is complicated and that they deserve more credit than they are given. And I think that what we are learning is that we're at a moment right now when people, what we're seeing quite clearly is that there is no single issue like terrorism that defines the foreign policy agenda, and that this is a complex world, and we need a more diverse toolkit than President Bush was willing to bring to it. I think you can make that point and do it successfully. But let me just say one other thing about the binary world, is that the Republicans have used this sort of binary world as a way of attacking Democrats.
Right.
We have an opportunity to put the shoe on the other foot here. That is, it's not just about what is defining Barack Obama in binary terms, it's defining John McCain in binary terms. So that the more we say John McCain will follow George Bush's go-it-alone approach to
Pugnacious unilateralist. Is this on?
Pugnacious unilateralist.
Leave this on. Pugnacious unilateralist.
A wonderful phrase. If that's what we can define John McCain as.
Pugnacious unilateralism.
There you go. You heard it here. So that it very often, I think too often, we've let the conversation only be about us and not enough about them, and to try to define what their approach to foreign policy and national security is. We know from this research that people don't want go it alone. They don't want somebody who will blow off what the rest of the world thinks. They don't want somebody who will only use one of the tools in the toolkit and forget about the importance of diplomacy. And again, I think it all comes down to this idea of balance. People know that George Bush does not represent balance, and that if we can make that kind of case against John McCain, that's quite powerful.
Let me open the floor to questions or comments. Yes, sir. And tell us who you are.
Ian Welsh from Fire Dog Lake. One of the things that you said was that the #1 security issue right now on Americans' mind is actually foreign dependence on oil.
Dependence on foreign oil, right?
Yeah, and it seems to me that at this point in time, the Republicans are winning that.
Right.
So actually, they're winning the foreign policy debate at this point in time with drill, 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 drill. So actually, we're losing it.
I think that is not true. Here is a place where I think that the public opinion research reveals something different. I think the Obama campaign ought to be more aggressive in defining this, but that if it is a choice between somebody whose focus is on the development of alternative energy, not just so that we are less dependent on foreign oil, but less dependent on oil itself, so that we are no longer hostage to OPEC and to the oil companies, versus somebody who emphasizes the importance of developing our oil resources here at home to bring down the price of gas. By about 2.5 to 1, they want the alternative energy person.
So are you saying that Barack Obama has failed to make that connection?
Right. I think we have failed to frame this in terms of the Republicans really doing the oil companies' bidding here, that it's not just about oil, it's about their obstruction to the development of alternative energy. Senator Obama received a lot of criticism a couple of weeks ago when he said that he would entertain the idea of drilling here at home. And people said, oh, flip-flop, he's taken the bait. The context for that and again, at some level I would fault the Obama campaign for not emphasizing this context enough, is that there is this Gang of 10 bill in the Senate that does a lot of things, including allowing some expanded oil drilling, not in the way that the oil companies would want.
Right.
And so what Senator Obama said, I like the fact that there are people who are willing to meet in the middle to get something done. And in that context, I would support their provisions on oil drilling. And so the news reports never talked about the legislative context and this idea of meeting in the middle. The other piece of this that I think could be quite powerful is at that moment when this legislation is no longer the Gang of 10, it's expanded quite a lot, Senator McCain said, I can't support this because it removes the tax preferences for the oil companies. Well, the idea that John McCain would oppose a meet-in-the-middle solution because he is so beholden to tax breaks to the oil companies is a story in itself. And that's a sort of powerful kind of argument we ought to be having here. So, but I would not, I don't take the point that we are losing the debate on energy. At the end of the day, I think that the landscape is still in a place where Democrats can win this successfully. The other thing is, as gas has moved below $4 a gallon, the dynamics of this has changed a little bit, and it's even made people even more open to the alternative energy emphasis.
Interesting. Other questions? Yes, right here.
I have two questions. Question one, it's a tactical question. Using Rovian logic, you attack the strength and turn it into a weakness. Given that there is this thing out there that suggests that simply because John McCain was either A, a prisoner of war, or B, in the Senate for a really long time, he somehow has better bona fides in international relations. That's where I'm wondering if you can find from your polls some way that we can turn that against him as a Rove would. The other thing is, given America's quite parochial perspective and lack of international appreciation, Obama goes to Europe, makes common cause with the community, and is castigated, and yet Cindy McCain goes to Georgia, and there's no corresponding criticism. Any thoughts on those points?
Yes, I think they're both good points. The one thing I would say on attacking McCain at his strength is there is what the McCain campaign has been trying to do in the past couple of weeks is have the whole debate about Iraq be focused on the surge, that McCain was for it and Obama was against it, and now Obama won't even admit that it worked. Well, you know, there's this other part of the Iraq decision making: should we have gone to war in the first place? And that as well. But I think that you know, taking this back to the original judgment to go to war, well,
this is, I mean, we had John Kerry speak across town, and this is very important in people in this whole fake binary question about the surge. And Kerry made very clear, and I've heard Barack Obama say the same thing, we've been seduced into a debate about tactics and not having a conversation on strategy, strategic objectives, and the complete failure to achieve those objectives. So I would assume that's where you're going.
Yes, that's where I'd go. But if you look at the long reach of Senator McCain's record, and talk about kind of a limited toolkit, he generally does have one answer for all challenges, which is to send in the troops.
Right.
I remember at the time that President Clinton decided...
Well, send in the troops or cut taxes.
There you go. At the time that President Clinton decided to send American troops to Bosnia, or Kosovo, Senator McCain said this is not troops to engage militarily, because our campaign was fought by air by and large. And Senator McCain said this is a big mistake. The only way we can win there is with massive ground forces. Well, it turns out he was dead wrong in his military judgment. He has been dead that we prevailed there as part of a NATO alliance, not on our own. We went through that entire conflict without a single American casualty. And Senator McCain was wrong on his fundamental judgment. He's been wrong many times before, and his instinct is always to send in the troops. And so that's a story I think that is worth telling in terms of his judgment. And really, when we get to the end of September, I think the first debate is September 29th, and then a couple of in October. I think that Senator Obama really does have the potential and the debating ability to give better than he gets on these issues.
Let me ask Solana a quick question before we go to the next one, and we'll go in the very back while I'm asking Solana a question, and would love Jeff to give a quick comment. I do read foreign blogs, and I typically look at the foreign policy, national security stuff. In fact, I read more foreign blogs than I read American blogs. And my sense is that much of the world thinks that America is in a weakened state because we set out objectives and can't achieve them, over and over and over again, that we don't look like we can achieve the results we set out for ourselves. And when you do that, your allies don't count on you, and the bad guys move their agendas. I'm wondering, one, if you get that sense, because you're not always covering the foreign policy side, but you get the sense that the world thinks we can't achieve our objectives. And then to Jeff, do Americans get the sense that they're frustrated that we can't get their objectives, or do Americans still think fundamentally America can do whatever it sets out for itself to do?
I don't think that people think about American foreign policy along those lines. I mean, it's not a priority for them in that sense. I mean, I think the
People who aren't foreign policy addicts, maybe.
maybe,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, because that's part of the thing. It's like, you know, if you read a UK blog or a blog from somebody who's educated at the same, you know, foreign policy school as, you know, other people that you work with, I'm talking about, you know, reaching out, extending much further to extremely local voices.
Right.
I think the point where people are maybe confused are in the objectives that the United States sets itself. I mean, and they're very good at pointing out hypocrisies in U.S. Positions. For instance, a Chinese nationalist will point out that the United States is always promoting democracy around the world, yet they seem to be supporting the Dalai Lama, who is not a publicly elected official, never been elected to office, and is the head of, you know, a spiritual movement. Some would call it a religion. So are we for theocracy? Are we for democracy? Those are the kind of things that foreign bloggers will point out and question. And those are the kind of questions that I think Americans should be asking themselves as well, looking at it from the outside in.
Thank you. Jeff, quick response. We're getting short on time, and I want to get this person in the back.
Well, the one thing I'd say is that what they know for sure now, after the experience of Iraq, is that we can't achieve our objectives the way we're currently trying to.
That we cannot
That we
achieve-
cannot, we certainly cannot do it on our own. We can't impose our will on the world, that we have to find a way to work.
And there's a sense of limit, a sense of being stretched, a
Well,
sense of...
there is definitely some of that, and they think of it as a zero-sum game in terms of what we are able to do here at home. But for that reason as well, they return to this emphasis on international cooperation, being able to work with others, for having us do our fair share, but in a way that others are doing their fair share as well.
We've got just 4 minutes, so let me get this person, and then you can add your comment.
Hello.
Identify yourself, please.
My name is Virginia Cast, and I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area. Why is it that the press, including bloggers, pick up words like the surge, 2 words, and the tax policy, and go with it in a very predictable manner when the surge, in fact, included a great deal of bribery on the ground and not so much use of troops. It wasn't the surge of people, it was bribery to a specific tribe. And why is it also that the tax policy of McCain and the tax policy of Obama isn't being talked about so that people realize that McCain is going to raise taxes, lower taxes on the upper class by 1% more below Bush, what Bush has done, and Obama is going to lower taxes on people making less than $118,000.
I need to, so we
But
get
why
your
is
questions.
it that the press
We're
doesn't
ending.
go
I
into
understand.
these things?
I understand. Thank you. So the question is, to re-clarify, we've got the hook coming in for us. We've got to end shortly. But the question is a good one. The question is, why do people fall into sort of easy framing? You know, I remember when John McCain, whom I've known since 1994, was not talking about 20,000 troops. In fact, he thought 20,000 troops wouldn't do it. He was where Big Brzezinski was. Big Brzezinski didn't think we would do it, but he said you need 400 to 500,000 troops to achieve the objectives you said. And so to some degree, we fell into, you know, framing there. And also, I agree with you on discussing economic policy and the various things that we find in, you know, ourselves framed in there. But on framing, Jeff, if you can just offer a very quick question, and I want Solana to have her last moment. I cut her off for a moment.
Well, language matters. That's a part of this project. The more we can describe what the Republicans want is going it alone, and we know that phrase is resonant. That matters. But look, the presidency is a very big pulpit, and you have more power to create language. And very often inside the bubble, people go along with it. We talked at the beginning of the surge whether we ought to be using their language or talking about it as an escalation. Since there was no end in sight, it sort of defeated the idea of a surge as being something temporary.
Well, people like me, I mean, I'm perfectly fine with little corruption. I thought corruption was a better way to do and look at stability, as opposed to sending in more men and women into a management mess, and where we were engaged in a tactical downward slide. But this is not the time to debate that.
Yeah.
It's back to polling. But Solana, I want to give you an opportunity. I've been given a chance for 2 more questions. So, but let Solana. I cut her off, and I apologize.
The point I wanted to make before was partly, in a case like the surge, for instance, or when George Bush goes out and declares peace in Iraq, mission accomplished, that at those points, the foreign bloggers, for instance, Middle Eastern bloggers, are laughing their heads off.
Yeah.
And very eloquently and with real examples of how things look. So when we're looking at press coverage, when looking at binaries and, very simplistic ways of looking at things, it has to do with, a comfort zone and being willing to step out of the comfort zone and ask questions about, well, this narrative that's been created around an issue, how can we break that? How can we get Palestinian bloggers and Israeli bloggers who are talking about the same events in completely parallel realities? I mean, freedom fighters, terrorists. How do we get people to jump over? And it's very important in American society.
Yes, ma'am. If you'll identify yourself too.
My name is Monica Day. I live in Capitol Hill, and my question is for Solana. What is the opinion, generally, of the foreign female bloggers of the American women? Are we thought of as the Sex and the City type with just nothing between our ears, and we just care about new handbags and purses? And I was also wondering, I'm hosting a Ugandan volunteer student. What are you doing tonight?
Oh, good. Foreign female bloggers. Are foreign bloggers' impressions of Sex and the City, big tent
I think,
ladies?
and this is one of the difficult parts. I think most foreign female bloggers probably aren't thinking so much about American women. They're thinking about women in their own country and their own condition. And there are a lot of women who are blogging online and using the internet to do, for instance, anti-street harassment campaigns in Egypt, all over the Middle East. I think they're not thinking about it in terms of women in the United States. They have their own issues, and there are a lot of women who are blogging about women's rights and women's issues.
We're about to get cut off. I want to thank Jeff and Solana. I'm getting mixed signals here. So do we have 30 seconds, or do we have time for a question? We got one more? Okay, one more question. So no more signs.
Okay,
yes.
I just wanted to ask.
If you'll identify yourself,
Sorry,
please.
I'm Hillary Bach. I write for Obsidian Wings and now the Washington Monthly.
A little more lungs.
Sorry, I said I'm Hillary Bach. I write for Obsidian Wings and also for the Washington Monthly.
Great.
I was wondering whether it's really right to say that Americans now do realize that we can't do whatever we want to. I was struck in the aftermath of the problems in Georgia with the number of people who were just saying, my God, we've got to do something, without particularly asking what or whether there was something we were capable of doing that would help.
And how we got set up, in fact, for that test. Had you polled this, done this, all this research before the Georgia, Russia conflict?
One quick thing I'd say about what happened between Russia and Georgia is how little it changed the arc of public opinion. In terms of certainly did not move people to be more inclined to think that we have to have an activist role in the world, did not create a shakeup that moved people off of their focus on the economy or gasoline prices. I don't sense that there is any great belief in the country as a whole that we need to be far more engaged there. In fact, in the NBC Wall Street Journal poll that was conducted immediately in the wake of all of this, people were given a list of 7 issues and said, what are the 1 or 2, so you got 2 bites at the apple, that matter the most right now, that are most important for the United States to pay attention to. out of a grand total of 6% chose the situation with Russia or Georgia as one of their top 2 concerns. So it certainly didn't rivet American public opinion, and I don't think create any great groundswell for us to engage in another massive effort there.
Right. In closing, let me just say, this is an important study, and to look at it, go to the website of the Better World Campaign. I love the Better World Campaign. I mean, it's a great effort of the UN Foundation to sort of engage both sides of the aisle. Remember, Bill McInturf was part of this same study. John McCain's pollster. People ought to be writing and asking Bill about these results in a friendly way, a civil way.
Bill has a slide in the presentation about what all of this means for
their
Republicans
party, yeah.
and how they can take advantage of it and what they have to do, what kind of adjustments they need to make in order to deal with this new reality.
But I want to thank the Better World Campaign for doing this. And in my own editorial, because there are a lot of people here, and I feel awkward about this Securing America evening. As I look at what Americans really want when I read this, I think they want return to a world where there's trust. Where there's trust in a kind of globalization that benefits Americans and those abroad, not necessarily a zero-sum, where there's trust, trust being built as opposed to just fear. I think we've tilted from a relatively high trust world at one point into a very high fear world, and it would be nice to see Democrats and progressives begin to get out of the box of feeling so insecure as a Democratic Party, in my view, about the national security dimensions of this, that sometimes power has to be deployed, but we've got too many, in my view, too many folks who tilt that way too often. And I think you'll find that sensibility in this study that Jeff Guerin did. Solana, I want to thank both of you. Please give a round of applause to both of our panelists. I want to thank everyone. Right? Oh, and we have these graphs, the PowerPoints that we didn't show you, but we talked about in the very back if you'd like to pick them up. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.